but I'm here, so I don't know. I no longer need a recording.
Damn it, sorry. Okay, so we went through, sorry for starting the recording late. We went through an excellent suggestion from Felix to combine Polis with argument mapping. And can we use argument mapping to help people realize their priors, their reasoning flaws, or guide the questions that Polis asks instead of just random questions. So that's the nutshell. We got into the details of that a bit. And let's assume we all know what Polis is, but basically it's a way to ask a small number of random questions and then put you in about belief and put you in clusters based on that. Now, one thing we're getting into is that, yes, the real motivation of that is not just belief, but goals. And goal alignment is a totally different thing than belief alignment.
Right. An interesting question that comes up is, for example, can Polis work across different topics? Because right now what they do is they say, okay, this is the question we want to answer, and then everybody can post statements. But would this even work in a more generic sense that that you say, okay, we have this huge pool, and this is about all the questions. Like, does this clustering of voting behavior go cross topic, or does it just not make sense anymore?
That's a perfectly valid question. And I think the reality is, if you're clustered in quite a few dimensions, the clusters become a bit meaningless. So you want to specialize and do a kind of dimensionality projection on the current domain. But then at some point, you want to look at cross-domain evidence or cross-domain inspiration. The context matters. I do
think you can also just cluster by context and still have this huge argument map, global argument map.
I suspect that's true, yes.
Yeah.
And it would certainly be my preference.
Yeah. And even another thought, like I thought a lot about this from different angles. I think there's some research about that small groups can use argument mapping to improve their reasoning, right?
Yes, that is established.
And then my thought was, okay, why not have small groups of video calls on this argument tree and let people like evolve it together, like especially people who don't have the same opinion, like let them, while discussing, extend the tree.
That is partly the goal of the work I'm doing with Jack on SenseCraft, right? The gamification. He's trying to get teams in a competitive game where people are co-building the argument tree, but they're competing on putting the most significant thoughts in the tree, where most significant would use a bunch of measures, but the most naive measurement is something that provokes a lot of further reaction, which is too naive for my taste, but it's a start. But the idea of how do we reward quote unquote good behavior in the tree, either something that is like, for example, reward synthesis moves, like saying there's this opinion, that opinion, well, here's the common ground, and rewarding identifying the common ground, rewarding finding the key argument, rewarding finding the the argument that helps change people's mind, that kind of stuff, right? And being able to identify the capacity to make those moves would actually, or make the right predictions, as I said before. In the case of goals, by the way, one aspect that I think is really important, we speak of the Bayesian network of argument, but I think for goals, it's really important to identify, okay, I want to do this. Why do you want to do this? What's the further goal? And do that why, do that why. And often there'll be huge disagreement on goals that can be actually traced to a disagreement on means, because if you go downstream, there's agreement on goals, and there's disagreement on the belief that this intermediate goal will further the final goal. And so the alignment of goals and beliefs is quite close and interwoven. In identifying, you want to do this. Why? Because you think it's good for that. Well, what if there's evidence that it won't help that goal?
Yeah. But on the other hand, I think the more generic the goal, the easier it is to align.
It is.
Right?
It is.
Like if you don't align on goals, then find a more generic goal. Basically.
Exactly. So finding the beliefs behind the goals, like you have this goal, why? Because you think it'll help this other thing, which we can agree on. So let's talk about, will this really help that? Or will there be side effects? And for me, that's why the causality graph is so important, because so much of the disagreements is about having, yeah, well, this means we'll have this side effect that I think we can both agree is not good. So, and then there's agreement about how likely is that side effect, and how significant.
So causality, like, okay, two things. One thing is Jack is talking about permanent teams who agree, right?
No, he actually wants the teams to be diverse.
Okay, diverse doesn't mean they disagree. Or diverse in the sense of polarization.
Diverse in the sense of polarization, very much. I don't know how he plans to enforce that, and I keep asking. It's like but his idea is that if you have a team that is too homogeneous, it's not likely to do as well, because the scoring system should favor also playing devil's advocate and understanding the other person's position. So a more diverse team should do better. And to have most of the disagreement between intra-team, so that you have more considered moves and less flame war in the argument map itself. That is very aspirational in my mind, but I don't.
Sorry?
Go ahead.
Yeah, and are these permanent teams then?
They would be, yeah.
I imagine like randomly teams, like if you participate for 1 hour, then you're mixed with 2 other random people, and then you work on some part of the graph, and then next time you're with different people again.
That's of course possible. We thought about that, but I think it does kind of, again, what makes a good team, and that is a team that can contribute well, is also that they've learned to work well together. So there's this kind of balance there.
Right.
But yeah, I think both tournaments, like random team tournaments and established team tournaments, should both exist as modalities. I don't think there needs to be one right answer there.
Okay, yeah, interesting. Okay, and second question I had is causality already covered by a support edge in claims, or is that something different?
I think it's different.
Huh?
Do support and opposed claims correspond to causality edges? I think
we long ago discussed that the current support is like in its broadest. I don't remember whether we ever wrote up the definition.
It was very
but that it includes anything, yeah, including
okay.
causality.
Yeah.
So yes would be my answer. I don't fully understand why you say no.
I'm saying they're not identical, of course.
Oh no, but that's a different question. It includes.
Yeah.
But certainly it includes, yes.
Support.
And the big question is, to which degree do we want to formalize distinctions between different types of support? And that's. Yeah. And actually, what I find interesting about this whole discussion, and that's something I always felt, and that's why I personally prefer to focus on argument structure, is these are all different use cases you can better enable once we have a system that provides better argument structure, including opinion polling tools, including one-on-one conversations. But the big problem is that the tangible bit are the systems in need that work on top of the argument structure, including like taking 2 people and collaboratively appending to an argument structure. And I think what we need to start doing a bit more is more of that. Like, let's have a argument structure we all agree is not what we want, But at least then we have real use cases that people using it for a specific reason. Because it's a totally valid point that when people say, yeah, why would I add any claim here? And it's much easier to say, well, because rather than having your conversation on Slack, maybe you can move it to an argument tree and see what tools you need in order to be able to better do that.
Yep. I agree with that.
So you said we should like basically agree on something incomplete, on an incomplete model, and start implementing.
Yeah. And I think that's similar to what we agreed before New Year, right? And that's why Weapon started implementing something.
Yep. No, I agree. The perfect, we want to be able to express arguments. We need at least a model, syntax, and everything so we can express arguments. And I think something better than, what is it? Claim ML or what is the, what?
Kiala?
No. There is this markdown. Yeah, markdown.
Oh.
Arcdown.
Yes.
I think we can do something better than Arcdown.
It's pretty sophisticated, actually. If you look at the syntax, it's much more than it's when you only look at the examples.
I know.
Yeah.
There is a lot there. But it's how should I put it?
Was there even code reuse? There were some very fundamental things because I
you could reuse arguments and it's pretty good.
Yeah, it's very geared towards formal argument structure. It's not good at progressive formalization, I find. But that's me. Yeah. And I don't.
I actually contacted the author once, but never got a reply.
Jack contacted the Polis author and had a reply. He's very open.
Me too, but like the guy's not responding to me on Twitter now. He said like, let's continue the conversation on Twitter, and then like he's not responding.
Okay.
Yeah, probably very busy, I guess.
Yeah. Okay.
If we all agree that we should agree on an incomplete argumentation model, maybe we could just do that.
I'm still thinking of doing it on the basis of the framework I'm doing, because I still think frames are fundamental to argumentation description.
Maybe that's not incompatible.
Yeah, exactly. No, I'm just saying frames. I believe in frames.
But when we think in high level object, like,
yeah,
because you in your frames, you really want to like destructure the claims and get to the entity and stuff like this.
Yes.
But what we probably, when we say argumentation structure, we probably think about it at a higher level. Like all the other discussions had like claim as a unit.
Yeah, it's true. And I've no problem with, we all agree on argumentation formalization, right? And that means it's entirely possible to have a claim that is just a sentence and to have an argument structure that is just, here's the relation between the claims, and that's a frame by itself.
Exactly, like frame would just be a further step in formalization.
Yeah, right? Exactly. But
so we could probably agree on something incomplete that's like one step before, a bit more high level.
Yeah.
And see if that's compatible.
Yeah.
What do you think, Stephen?
It's very abstract. We'd have to see what happens when we try.
No, I mean like really on the level of claim and support.
Yeah, but I mean that's the modeling stuff we tried to do before, right?
Yeah, we did, like, but very often we went off and into discussions of things we were not able to solve, and some things we were able to solve, and we should like have these in a model, and everything else that's like incomplete or we're not sure about, we just take a random decision basically, or likely decision, and say, okay, that's it for now and can be improved.
And can we iterate? Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Yeah, the only problem will, of course, be, as always, like finding agreement on what minimal means, right?
It is.
Practical is maybe better, not minimal.
I think
Yeah,
it's,
so that then you need agreement on what on what it is that you're trying to be practical about. And if indeed you're just trying to, if the main thing you want to work on is I want to be able to add a claim to a system, yeah, then it's as simple as adding a string to a table. That could be the implementation, right?
yeah. I think what we're saying here is suspend the canonicality discussion.
Yes. So focus more on a model that can model one instance of argumentation. Well, in a way, that's what I do, because that's my basis. That's what I call my base layer, and the canonicality layer I see living on top of that indeed.
Yeah, your basic structure, if I understand well, is support oppose, right? It's
and it's just weeding out all the irrelevant supports and opposes. That's the only thing that my basic structure aims to do.
And negation is in there.
And negation is in there because that's how I enable reuse. And again, still I haven't seen anyone else use negation and statements that are free of context. Like once you start actually mapping out arguments in practice like that, you'll quickly notice why that is the case. And it's not that straightforward. Like Jonathan just like I think a week ago or 2 weeks ago before New Year's, I think added like one claim and instantly, boom, it's not free of context. And indeed, if you're used to using a system where that's not a requirement, where there's no goal of reusing claims, yeah.
Absolutely. The question of context freedom is quite fundamental, and this is what I was getting at with the formal informal. But I think I need to make it indexical, not indexical.
Maybe that's sad, because that's also the main usability issue I had during experience. Maybe indeed we shouldn't even go that far. Maybe we shouldn't focus on because that is a requirement for canonicality, right? But it's not a requirement for mapping an argument that's used and only relevant to one context.
The one distinction I think is really important that is missing in there, that for me is vital, is the distinction between arguing against the premise and arguing against the link of the premise.
Yeah. That I think, context free or not, that's also what's missing in a lot of systems.
Yeah. That's absolutely vital. It's not, I don't disagree.
That could be one option, like getting rid of the entire canonicality goal for now and just creating a structure that can allow to map arguments in context. Like
But that's in a way, when I speak of contextual names and name bindings, that's what I'm trying to do, right?
Exactly.
To say, here's a contextual version, and here's how it's mapped to a less contextual version, and here's the interpretation. And then if somebody,
but that's a canonicalization step we then would omit now.
But exactly what I'm saying, I'm trying to design that, but so it can be separated as a step. So that we can identify, okay, this step still needs to be done. This is not in, context-free form. It's not in reusable form. And here is how this reusable form corresponds or does not correspond to this other reusable form elsewhere, yada, yada, yada. But it's true that all this can be designed. I'm more and more certain. For me, it's part of the core design, but I'm more and more trying to separate them so that I can do the modeling with the semi-formal stuff and still be able to say, okay, in one context, this is what's happening. I won't worry about canonicality. I won't worry about this. And I can do it. By the way, the latest thing I'm still struggling a bit with is variables. Let me explain what I mean by that. I said there's a distinction between using the statement as a quote, that is, this is this formal thing, versus using it as this is what is meant by this statement. But in the case of a definition, there's kind of another layer. There's the exact statement of the definition. There's what the definition means and what the definition is trying to define, which are kind of three distinct entities. And in a way, the definitions is saying, there exists an X such that it can be defined by these statements. And this X has to have a distinct name. And this is where this name doesn't make the definition indexical because it's bound in a definition. So that's fine. But it's still a name. So I'm still struggling a bit with that one and making, but it's not a huge deal. It's just adjustments to what makes the statement become indexical. A name bound in a definition isn't, because it's a variable name as such, and it can be substituted. Whereas a name that is not bound to a definition means that the definition is indexical.
That's not true, because even I'm not certain I can follow 100%, but the last thing you said, your definition is based off other names, which again might not be defined. So
I'm assuming that a definition that uses indexical names is considered indexical.
Okay, so
there's a recursivity.
So only fully defined mathematical frame 100%, but then still, where does it end? What's the end node? Because
Circular.
you will always
what?
Circles?
Yes.
Like the dictionary is circular too.
The dictionary is circular. Yeah, this is a perfectly valid question. I am thinking in most cases, it's good enough for now. And I think instead of saying there is a ground, and because I don't believe in a ground.
Or axioms then?
Yeah, axioms. I'm saying not yet questioned axioms. Unchallenged axioms rather than absolute ground axioms. And then
how is a name different? How is a name about which there is no controversy any different than a non-ground, whatever you call it?
Well, it's saying there is a definition. The definition is not yet controversial.
Yeah. But aren't they semantically the same then? Like, it's more of a state of what is said about certain names that determines its state, as opposed to it being a different. So in other words, it would be modeled the same. It's like you wouldn't say Correct. This is an indexical claim or that's a non-indexical claim. Whether or not it's indexical is then determined, as the way you're explaining it now, by whether or not the names used therein are contested. And however you then measure or derive contested is probably, again, a structural thing of people having multiple different competing definitions for the same name.
Absolutely.
Somewhere recursively in there.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of mixing both. I think that you're right. I'll probably have to be a bit less pure about this and mix a little bit of axiomatics because I think it would help to have a little bit of axiomatics as a grounding mechanism. And in a way, this should be a context decision, right? What are the axioms?
It is. And I think it goes back to the discussion we've had and had a lot of agreement on before New Year's. It's also how you interpret it. If something is undefined and everyone interpreting it, allowing for the ambiguity of the stuff that is undefined,
yeah,
that it can still be non-indexical in use, in the sense that arguments
it's usable,
about it's usable in the sense that arguments about that undefinedness are relevant, and you all know you're talking about the same thing. But the stuff we want to avoid is like where disagreement about the context cannot be. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. I think I do. And this is really fundamental, because
that's the difference between what was it, the standalone claims and contextual claims. It's more of an intent users assigned to it, right? And the state.
I think contested is a good way to think about it. Is it contested? And that is necessarily contextual, right? The state, this is not structural. This is not, I can ask if this I can ask if this statement is grounded in axioms or not. And that's structural, right? Mm-hmm. Assuming there's a set of axioms that's common to everything, and those should be minimal. I can ask if the statement is grounded in axioms of a given context, which is a totally different question. And I can ask if a statement is uncontested in a given context, which is yet another question. And those are very, very different levels of truth. And knowing this statement is uncontested in this context, was contested in other contexts, is absolutely what the federation should give us, right?
But I think all of this is a different notion or problem of indexicality than.
Yeah, we're not about indexicality anymore. Like the axiomatic part is a bit of an indexicality thing, because if it's grounded in axioms, then we can have the notion of these are primitive notions. But what I'm seeing here, okay, let me get into that. I'm thinking of, okay, here's a definition of this concept as this frame. And let's assume that the frame is based on, and this is a bit circular because it's based on another frame, which is based on another frame. And you're right, Felix, there would be a kind of dictionary circularity, but still.
And that's why we start talking about indexicality, because it doesn't resolve that in any way.
Yeah. But I'm thinking the notion of improvement for me is really important. Like being able to say, I'm grounding this statement on these definitions, which are, immutable frames. And then I'm saying, well, this frame is not good enough, and I want to replace it with this better definition, more inclusive, more this, more that. And so I have to recalculate the dependent frames, which cascade cost, but TK. I mean, I'm accepting that cost. And of course, it can be an opportunity to revisit. Is that new definition fitting all the things that use it or not, right? And this, maybe it won't be automatic, but that's another story. But certainly automatically you should know, well, this is using a definition that was improved. Are you okay with the new definition? And there has to be a well-groundedness, and that way it has to be a DAG of saying, we are basing this definition on this definition, this definition. And if this definition changes, well, it will cascade, and that has to end. So this has to be a DAG. So let's go on some very, and some of the notions will be not fully, will be words like, okay, we're using the Wikidata concept, or we're using as an external system, and I'm fine with that. And saying, well, if this one evolves, it may mean revisiting stuff. But ideally,
I have to leave in 5 minutes, by the way. Just
okay. But what I'm saying is, if we say we accept in this context that this primitive notion is uncontested, then we can structure, like we can use a kind of frame whose only content is a text definition, right? And then say, okay, this one is accepted in this context. Then we can say this whole construction is well grounded on those atomic definitions. And then if somebody says, well, this definition is not well grounded anymore because this term has been contested and forked or whatever, then we can reconstruct the chain, go back up the chain and say this definition, which was non-indexical, has been replaced by an indexical one because we discovered a flaw in the grounding.
But okay, define context and accept it. Like if you have, yeah, just in the previous sentence, what does it mean for a definition to be accepted in a context?
That is kind of part of my definition of context. The context is something where some names are bound to definitions and where claims are bound to truth values. That's pretty much what a context is.
And these cannot be contested?
Yes, they can. That's exactly what I'm describing. But there's a certain, like, something that is considered true and foundational in a context, because foundational is this thing then considered true, can be contested because contexts evolve in time. And then that means that a lot of things that was
And how do you contest? Because you mentioned accepted. So once somebody contests it, then all of a sudden this indexical thing becomes non-indexical?
And vice versa. Yes, the indexicality thing is a transient status, and it's based on the acceptance status, which is also transient. The definition is immutable, but its status in a context is mutable. Its true status in a context is mutable. And its well-groundedness status in a context is mutable.
I mean, yeah, that's what you want to call indexical. I would maintain everything is indexical.
Yeah, maybe it's not the right term.
Because if you map this out, I mean,
yeah, you're right. It's not the right term. It's not indexicality. I'm still looking for the right term, but it's grounded, well-grounded.
I would call it more consensus.
Bye-bye.
See, I would call it more like consensus. There's no objection. It's not objected. There is whatever justified, something along those lines, if I understand you correctly. Like assuming all of these definitions, but nobody sees problems with in that context. So in that sense, I would call a context an aggregation of a lot of definitions.
Yep.
In that context, there's no objections in these axioms. You could they're not axioms. I don't know. I think it's separate from indexicality in the sense of like if we're going to build a system that that doesn't try to be canonical, because that's why we started this discussion. What is the context even? What does it mean? Like and do you even allow claim reuse in such a?
Yes, because and you're right that I'm conflating two things, and thank you for pointing it out. But I am conflating two things, and maybe I need to separate them. There's the notion of the uncontested grounding, and there's the notion of non-indexical grounding. When I'm using the name of a context without defining it further, because it's still vague, I haven't tried to define it, that's indexicality. And that is, I've made an informal statement. I start with informal statements because I haven't defined all my terms, and that's a normal status. And then it's like, okay, what do you mean by this? What do you mean by that? What do you mean by this? Then slowly you start being more serious about the definitions, and at some point, some of your terms may become more and more, or they can, you've defined
they become more formalized, and you add more surrounding claims that all add to that context. But then still, any of these claims that make up that context, a whole bunch of people may only believe in a subset or have only had a chance to look at one part, etc. Like, what do you do with all that? And does that mean uncontested or not? And
and you're absolutely right that in a way I should maybe I'm not sure about that, but very good question. Should I separate the belief acceptance context from the definition acceptance context, because those are totally distinct, right? I accept that we have the same definition of climate change, but I believe it exists, someone else doesn't believe it exists, but we have the same definition. So right? So when I speak of well-grounded, I'm speaking about agreeing on definitions.
Yeah.
And this is different from agreeing on belief. And when I speak of,
but then we go, what are definitions? Because I mean, I would argue, and that's why I boil down everything to believe. I would argue you believe that something is a correct definition or a useful definition, essentially.
And this is why I was speaking about acceptance, because I really meant acceptance of definitions, which is different from acceptance of claims. And I probably should be more formal about that. I'm saying there's a context where this definition is accepted, as opposed to a definition where the claim is accepted.
Yeah, but who does the
context?
Okay, but this is dissolving again into a like how to deal with definitions and discussions. I understand you. If you have a context and everyone in that context accepts the definitions, then you could say they share that context.
Yes.
Right.
Right.
I get that, but I think a big part of discussion is exactly that you don't share those, you don't accept those shared
Absolutely,
definitions.
absolutely. And
So
the point then is to make a different context and to say, well, actually, now that if we want to include these people, we have to create an encompassing context where this definition is contested. And then we have to see how can we repair, like it would cascade.
If we just said context is a set of definitions that everyone can accept, that is participant. So a context is again, it's not a thing you define, it's something that originates with a set of people that might share a set of shared accepted definitions.
I would have a context for my own.
Okay, but so a context would be essentially a set of definitions.
Yeah.
And maybe later more, but yeah, like a set of definitions. And then okay. But so whenever you make a claim, how do you know whether or not it falls in that context? Well, every claim can be viewed from a whole bunch of potential different contexts is what.
Well, if it uses concepts that are not yet defined, then the concept is not well grounded. So you add the definitions. And
but where, in which context?
Well, probably
like who makes a context? When does it arise? And
anybody
that's,
can
I guess,
make
what I'm hinting at.
No, okay, perfectly valid. In my mind, everybody has a context for themselves and the question, and for any group they participate in. So when you're, if I want to introduce a new definition, I'll probably do it in my own context and do the equivalent of a pull request on the collective context I'm part of and say, hey, how do you feel about including that definition? Because this is what I think this term means. And then there's some consensus mechanism.
Outside of scope of a particular discussion?
Discussion happens in context.
Yeah, of course. If everyone has a context by its very nature, every discussion happens in your context.
Yep. But when you want to introduce that claim in that collective context, right? Then you're saying, hey, I've made that claim in my context. I think it should be part of the collective discussion. And right now it will enter the discussion, the collective context with the status not yet well grounded because the definition is not being accepted. And supposing maybe you haven't done it, but suppose you do it, then you say, okay.
But who needs to accept it? And when is it well grounded?
And that's the idea. Whenever there's a collectivity, they have a context that corresponds to the collectivity, and they have some social norm about how do we accept definitions, claims, yada, yada, yada. And that is context dependent.
And dependent on how you define the members of the group.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But that's a social, like personal context you control, but social contexts have social rules for member acceptance and definition acceptance, whatever. And that's a social process, right? It's like every GitHub project has their own social norms for accepting pull requests. It's exactly the same idea, right? And this, I don't see that as in scope of problem definition. The problem definition says context has some governance principle, which is out of scope for saying, okay, I've become aware of a definition. Do I accept it as valid? And if I accept contradictory definitions for the same terms, then the term becomes not well-grounded and cascades, yada, yada, yada. If I don't accept it, what I'll probably do instead is I'll say, there's this definition in this other external context. I want to give that another name locally because this is not how I define this. And so in my context, that definition has this new name. And then this claim from this other definition, from this other context, I will kind of rebind to my different names. But I'll accept the definition as this definition exists. It's just not bound to a name, or it's a definition. It's just a thing. And something makes use of that, but it's not grounded in terms we accept. And here's how it translates to the terms we accept. And here's the truth status in that context, the terms we accept. Now, where I
find it a very, very weird way of looking at context, like just to highlight one problem. How do you deal with multiple definitions? Like many times I have a discussion about claims, and the claim in one, I mean, I may have multiple operational definitions of claim that I use depending on what I would call context, depending on the discussion I'm having. And it's not because it's just.
No, that's extremely important. In my mind, if you have multiple definitions of the same term, I think there's two scenarios, right? Either they're different definitions that you use in different contexts because you want to emphasize different things, but it's the same concept, underlying concept. Then you can state the equivalence and create a new definition.
But that's not.
That is the union of the definition, and then that replaces the individual definitions, even if you have a favored definition in the pointed definition in the context. But you point to the unification as a distinct object. If you have, if they're actually distinct, then you'd create a distinction object and say, well, they're almost the same, but
it's more organic. I mean, I think a big part of why you think different about this is because for you, everything has a fundamental truth concept that can be defined, that can be like identified, and that you can uncover whether or not you're talking about the same thing. But
yeah, I don't know about fundamental,
I think people
truth, but uncovering
underlying
identity. Yes, I believe it's possible. It's a process,
so
but it's
it is a process. That's the point. Like it is a process. It's always a process, and that process happens in a context. That's what the context is.
I agree totally with that. The being able to uncover whether two names correspond to the same thing is really the fundamental process of argumentation, or one fundamental process of argumentation.
But so I don't get why you see yourself. That's why I don't get the point that you see one individual as context. It's the discussion in the effect of a coherent set of information that you bounce up against each other, that's somehow making claims about one another, that forms a context.
I see what you're saying, but I think context is more generic than that, because in my own thoughts, I have many contexts, right? In my own self, I have multiple perspectives that I bounce against one another. So the context is both super individual and infra individual, and also individual. For me, creation of context should be very easy, ad hoc. It's like making a fork. It should be a casual operation. I'm creating a context for thinking about, for example, what if hypothetical world. That's a context.
Okay, to make that very concrete, the way I see this, and it might be similar to what you're saying, but to me, the point of adding, for example, to a canonical claim database is if there's no context specified, it's all possible likely interpreted contexts. That is the context. If you have a claim that doesn't specify any context, it is just the claim itself and how people look at that claim that determines a context. Then when you start adding context, that's when you can add definitions. That's one functional way of doing that, but it can also be like a specific website we're looking at or whatever, like not just a claim in general, but a claim as it's being uttered in one media source. That's what I call adding context. And if then, essentially, if you disagree or are unwilling to accept the context, the requirements of what makes up the discussion, at that point, you can no longer fruitfully participate in a discussion because you're working from different assumptions that are supposed to be accepted if you're willing to carry on that discussion in that context. You can certainly argue it's not a useful context because I don't like the definition, or the definition is wrong, or whatever, but that's a different discussion.
Right. See, okay, some parts of what you're saying I agree with, some parts, and especially at the beginning, because when you say you add it without context in the canonical claim, for me, it's like you add it with unspecified context. And then you try
intentionally.
Yeah,
and that's what I always mean when you add a claim that is free of context. It means that any potential context that may allow that claim to be interpreted differently is free play.
Exactly.
That is the context.
And there I agree with. And there I agree with you. There I agree with you. You add it decontextualized because, and then it's just, for me, that's just a string of characters. It has no meaning.
It has meaning. People read it, and people are likely to interpret the same context or not. But until until that's not more formalized, or you don't specify a more specific context, that is also a context, just an ambiguous context.
Yeah. And maybe no meaning is an understatement, but it has a totally underspecified meaning, I guess.
The scenario.
Yeah, and then you try to identify context in which is interpreted this way, that way. And here the whole question of clusters is that Felix brought in is really interesting, because I'm speaking of very ad hoc context. A group creates a context. But what's interesting is that there are natural communities, like communities of practice or professional orders, which define natural context for interpretation of certain sentences. This sentence arose in that cultural context. And that is what you mean by context, I think. And it's a more, I'm using context very much as a token, right?
What do you mean by a token? And what do you mean by a community creates a context? I'm still trying to visualize that.
When I say when I say anybody can create a context object. Okay, my notion of
what is a context object?
I kept saying it's a set of giving truth values and to definitions and possibly claims, and maybe I should separate those, but at least definitions. But I probably want.
Yeah, I think I get that. I agree with. But I don't agree that
the social mechanism for deciding who gets to accept and who gets to assign truth values, and what is the social process. Do you need consensus, majority, unanimity for assigning a truth value to a claim in that context? So that is for me what a context is.
And what do you do once you? I mean, I just don't see creating context as an operation that people will ever do. I think contexts arise out of doing other things.
And that's the other definition of context. You're speaking about, let me call them organic contexts, right? And it's much more, and yes, I'm creating a context object that is distinct. Organic contexts are emergent. They don't have clear boundaries. They don't have, but
can you, so we agree on organic context. Can you give me an example of a non-organic context? Like, why would I want to create a non-organic context? What am I doing, and who am I? It's
because, again, think of it as fork pull request. There's a community I'm part of. They've created a knowledge graph. Here are the claims that we have agreed so far. I want to either add to, modify, edit, contest, whatever. So I do a pull request, I create my own contest. I say, well, this is how I see things. So I do things in my own forked context, where I say, okay, this is how I see things, pull request, and then the community decides to accept or reject or modify the pull request and say, well, we agree or we don't agree, or we.
Which community is this? And
the community in control of the context. For me, context has to have an explicit community. When I say and the community to decide who accepts, there's an explicit community and an explicit decision process, which is social.
Can you give me an example of such a community?
Fucking GitHub.
GitHub is a platform, and there's many different communities using it.
Exactly.
So any project on GitHub?
Any project on GitHub and any fork on GitHub.
And what does that have to do with argumentation?
Because when we are creating a common knowledge graph, I think it's exactly the same thing as creating consensus on a code base. We're trying to.
Yeah, but I'm trying to understand the former, and you can't exemplify. You're saying it's the same as that, and then your example is that, but I'm trying to understand the former. Like, give me an example of a community that's trying to build consensus that would construct a explicit context.
Yeah.
And not let it arise in an organic matter, because that's what you're trying to argue.
Yes.
I can't think of examples. Even in like highly defined communities, like quantum physicists, there's disagreement on some things. Like for each different disagreement, am I supposed to create like a different context? And then how do you deal? I'm just trying to understand it.
Okay. Let's do it with that, because obviously the GitHub example is not passing through. But it seems to me like when there is, but let me continue with GitHub a bit, and then I'll come back to quantum mechanics, because I think it's a good example. Suppose there is a GitHub project that says, here is what quantum.
Let's not suppose. Okay, React. Yeah.
No. Okay.
I'm say any GitHub thing.
Yeah, sure. I'm thinking of one which experienced a fork. I think OpenOffice is a good example, right?
Okay.
OpenOffice is a certain view of the world and what a document is and blah, blah, blah. And the people want to change it. And so they do pull requests, and that's a context. It's like, I believe this would be improved by this pull request, by this fork, and that's a micro context. And then if it gets merged by community consensus mechanism, people with merge rights, and any one of them can accept a merge, then it changes the consensus view of what OpenOffice is, the head. And then at some point, there's a community who had this other view of what OpenOffice should be, and they came up with changes which were not accepted, so they forked, and now we have LibreOffice.
How is this fork connected to the original? And how does that resolve support argumentation between these two contexts?
Now, in the case of that, okay, that's a good question. In the case of GitHub, and this is where my GitHub metaphor fails, consensus is not a goal. However, for example.
No, in the case of GitHub, consensus, I think that's why it's such a bad analogy. In GitHub, consensus is the end goal. You merge every PR, and that assumes that everyone contributing to the code base agrees with everything in the code base, essentially. Which is a very, I can't find an equivalent context of that in the real world, which is what I'm asking you.
Until the tension is such that there's a fork and LibreOffice happens.
Yeah.
And then there's consensus between forks is not a goal, is what I should have said. Whereas it would make perfect sense to say, this is what we disagree on between OpenOffice and LibreOffice, but we can still cherry pick changes from one another, which you can do in GitHub, but it's just a bit more intricate and becomes more and more difficult as they diverge, where you can say, okay, this bug fix here is actually still applies to our common code base, so I'll cherry pick.
Yeah, if you can merge the changes, sure.
Yeah, exactly. So now let's transpose that to quantum physics, because I think, so there's a context which is what all quantum physicists agree on, and that's a very restricted context. And then there's a bigger context, which is all claims under consideration by quantum physicists, right?
Which is all of these, I get that. If that's your definition of context, I get that. But like, who manages that context? Like, somebody created it, and do they have different names? How do I know which one of those I'm looking at any given time, etc.?
Right. The way I see it, if we're speaking about I assume in the case of quantum physicists that there can be automatic criterion decision for, are you a quantum physicist? Did you get a PhD in quantum physics, for example? Anybody with a PhD in quantum physics. And so that could create a context of people with PhD in quantum physics discussing quantum physics, and that could be administered in an emergent way. Or that's one option, that's one social mechanism, where there's a arbitrary mechanism that auto-enrolls. And there's another thing, which is I'm a quantum physicist and I say, okay, I'm trying to make here's the consensus space. And then there's a social process of trying to get other people to agree to use my repo or my context.
Yeah, I think I can follow a bit more now, but in essence, what you define as context, I would define as a community of people that all agree on a shared set of what I would call claims, by the way.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is useful. And at any given point, if you disagree, then it shows kind of your
how you disagree.
Well, no, I think that's where how you disagree, that's where I would call the argument map comes in. But you are calling context essentially a community that whatever gets, that's not just an argument map, but also an expressed agreement with claims in the argument map. That's what you define context, apparently. And that's something that through community processes, people can subscribe to, so they get updates of all the claims that people in that community, you call it context, have expressed agreement with. And then I would argue, if that's what you're designing, probably any individual in that community that hasn't expressed agreement yet, or that the agreement process, like 170% of people in the community agree with a claim that has been suggested as adding to the context of the assumptions, then it gets accepted, something like that. But this is something entirely different than what I call context. And
fair enough.
We always struggle with context, right?
Yeah, but just a slight, what you said is mostly accurate. I'll make a small correction.
And useful, by the way. If that's, I just would call it a community that agrees to work on a shared argument map, essentially.
Yes,
and
yes,
that's a very valid use case. But that's a super setting functionality of just having an argument map, which also has context, right? In
your sense of context, yes, it's
yes.
Yeah. But I will make a small correction. You kept saying you subscribe to claims that people have agreed to in the community. Mm-hmm. I think that actually it's you subscribe to claims that the community have agreed to are relevant, and then they can have any truth status.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, because you need some process. Yeah. Okay, this is actually super cool because that is, I think you talk about like bigger communities or bigger context. I prefer to call it community if you don't mind, because
so what about social context?
I still prefer to it's clear, right? You subscribe to a GitHub repo. The equivalent is there. There's a clear name. It has a thing. There's a place you go to.
Yes.
Whereas the context that I'm trying to explain in like a more
is a different thing. But there will
always organic. That's what I was trying to argue. But what you're arguing for is useful, and I agree. It's created and it's non-organic, but it's definitely a supersetting functionality of the stuff that also has context.
But I'm saying that I expect, I'll still call them social context, but I think it's good to call them social contexts. I expect social contexts to arise socially that will overlap organic contexts. That's purely an assumption.
Yeah, probably. I mean, yeah. I don't think that's relevant to think too much about now. I think what's relevant is that I actually agree that that use case is good, and it's partially be that a social context of two people talking to one another and needing to. Yeah. So if we want to build like argumentation software to simply improve everyday discussions, doesn't matter whether it's canonical or not. This is something that we also need. Ideally, these claims are then added to a canonical database. It might make sense to,
which is why I keep speaking of federation. For me,
yeah, but that's a question of how do you integrate like these claims made in social context into a canonical database, and that's where all the problems arise of stuff being free of context, etc. So,
yeah.
Because exactly like you say, you have a clear scope there, and I like this. This is workable. This is a useful feature. You have a clear scope, and it's at any given time, it's documented within the scope. If you're part of the social context, it's presumed that these things you need to accept anywhere else in the argument map. It does not matter where.
Correct. Absolutely
you can
correct.
argue, well, that's not relevant because of this shared assumption right there. That's the main problem, that you cannot do on a base layer where you don't have that clearly delineated scope that I keep saying.
Yeah.
So the only scope you can delineate is, well, this thing is ambiguous and should be interpreted as ambiguous.
Yeah.
And that's the big difference.
Yeah.
But that said, it's a super cool idea, and it might be fruitful to try to implement this together, even before trying to do the canonical thing, because indeed, in terms of modeling, a lot of the same things arise there.
It's funny because I feel I've explained that idea in exactly so many words before.
It is. But I mean, Timothy and I, we both feel that the need for the canonical thing is bigger. But I mean, both are needed. And yeah, they need to somehow connect. And
absolutely. Why am I still here, right? It's
yeah,
I do. Well, I mean, for me, I express it as federation, but federation is another technical implementation of canonicality. But we agree that the context should not be an island, and that is the overarching common goal. Whether there's one database or a inter-database query protocol is not relevant. What is relevant is federations must not be an island. Social context must not be an island.
There is one problem I see, though, even though it's useful, right? But what do you do with changing assumptions?
As I said, you can, if I assume, again, a social mechanism to accept. So if the community accepts as a community through whatever consensus, majority, whatever mechanism they have as a community, they say, okay, now we have this changing in the truth value of this assumption. And then, of course, it would cascade to anything everywhere that uses the assumption that this needs to be revised given.
Yes, and that's a community process to do that.
And that's a
review
process.
Essentially.
Yeah,
that makes sense. And that, I think, is something you cannot do on what I call a base layer. So, because I want the base layer to be immutable in that sense. In a social context sense, it makes sense to start removing arguments because they're no longer relevant because the assumptions have changed, the context has changed.
Correct.
But in a base layer,
correct,
you wouldn't remove it because
I wouldn't even remove.
You would fork, and you would
I wouldn't even remove it in the social context because I want to keep history. But but its status changes, and it's mutable in the context. But the true status, there's a kind of clear truth status in the context that doesn't make sense in the federation context. All you can say in the federation context is, well, this statement has this status in those contexts and that status in those contexts.
Essentially, put very practical, the main difference is, I think, in the federated place, every claim needs to have the context within the claim. So that's what, to me, it means free of context. But that's very tedious and hard to maintain. If you want to have more socially placed discussions in a social context, you want to have a list of assumptions that don't need to be added to each and every claim uttered in that social context.
Exactly.
But that's exactly what you have to do if you want to add these claims happening in that social context to a federated layer. Essentially, like a naive way of including a claim uttered in a social context would be by adding all of the assumptions at that point in time when it was uttered to the claim that you add to the federated context.
Well, again, if the claim construction, and we get back to the syntactic groundedness I was talking about, because if the claim is built of, it's a frame which is a CID, but which every element is a CID, then every element is a universally accessible object, right? It's not yes, it's being authored in the context, and its truth value is context dependent, or its acceptance value is context dependent, but its existence is not context dependent. It's part of the federation at whole. So whenever you have, like, think IPLD again, any IPLD node gives you all its predecessors if it's a well-grounded IPLD node. And this is what I'm trying to build with my notion of non-indexical frame. And again, that's not the right term, but everything has been based on something. So when you pull one claim, you pull its whole dependency tree because it comes with it by CID referentiality. But there's something different, which is that, in the federation, this claim has been seen in those contexts. And there, I think having an exhaustive list is ridiculous, but I probably have a kind of Bloom filter in the federation saying, here are, and that's probabilistic, but here are contexts that have assigned the truth value to this claim. So you can ask, what is the...
No, but I'm inquiring about what is the claim here. And I think that's the whole difference between a claim in a social context and a claim in what I would call a base layer.
What I'm saying,
and any shared assumption that's in the social context, once you add it to a base layer, is no longer present unless you add it.
No, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying the claim would have an explicit list of all its assumptions by
exactly, but that's
CID reference.
But isn't that just a list of assumptions at the point in time the claim was created in social context, of that social context?
Absolutely. And the claim has a acceptance status in that social context, which is based on the acceptance status of the premise in that social context.
Yes or no, that's the other thing, because sure, it's useful to have an explicit set of shared assumptions, but that not all of them might need to be necessary in order.
No. I'm saying those are the assumptions explicitly needed for that one, like the list of supports, basically. Here are the supports of this, the explicit supports of this, not all the shared assumption. Here's the explicit support, which has this, but also if the context has
the supports, it's the, I think there's a big difference.
No, 1 second. You also mean the entity definitions. When you
exactly, that's it.
And those would also
we're talking
be
about, is it relevant or not to argue against a different definition of God if within a social context you have a very concrete definition of God? No. So within that social context, you cannot start arguing about different definitions of God.
Correct. But what you would do is refer to God not by name, but by the definition. So that means there is an explicit CID of the God definition. No, that's exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying it's good to know which ones of the entities have been formalized so that at the moment it's exported.
Yeah, but that's why I always say definitions are part of context. But no, that's one way. And
what I'm saying is I want to make the definitions part of the statement, of the claim.
Yeah,
so that,
of course.
So that
but that's the different act than requiring the social context. Do we all agree with that definition that was added to that claim? You still need that list of assumptions. That's a different operation than just adding a definition to a claim.
They're both, for me, they both reinforce one another, because I'm using a definition, and then the question is this definition accepted in this context, right? Is that a shared definition in the context? So if I use definitions that are not shared in the context, well, my thing is not well grounded in this context.
So what you're
but it's still well grounded.
That any claim that gets added to a social context and gets accepted, automatically the definitions or the formalizations there within are also accepted or something.
I'm not automatically. That's the point. It's if they're not accepted, then that means this claim is marked as not well grounded in that context, which is not. It can still be accepted, which is different, but it's not well grounded. So it's a goal of each context to ground the names in the definition, to formalize them, to ground them in formal definitions, so that you evolve your claim towards well-grounded claims, which is distinct from accepted, refused. You can also refuse a well-grounded claim. It's a totally orthogonal axis. And then when that well-grounded claim is in the federation, we can say that well-grounded claim has been considered in all those contexts, and that's a Bloom filter or whatever. And so we can see that in those contexts where it's being considered, it's either considered accepted, not accepted, well-grounded, not well-grounded, whatever. No, sorry, well-grounded is syntactic, that's the point. But considered not accepted, not accepted is a social truth value, right? It's accepted in so many contexts representing so many people, and it's refused in so many contexts, so many people. Or it's, I could say that, and this is a slightly different thing than grounded, well-grounded or not, I can say that the definition is ambiguous. So it's grounded in non-name, it's grounded in a frame definition, but that frame definition has been declared ambiguous in that context. So that means, again, the concept is not well-grounded, even if it is a frame, because it's been declared ambiguous in that context. So there's many statements about you can make about the frame. So you will have, by asking the context, it's like, okay, here's this statement which exists. Suppose it's well-grounded. Here's this well-grounded statement, syntactically well-grounded statement. And then that context will say, well, this is how I express this because I resolve this and that ambiguity. And then I can, or I've refused it, or I say, here are many possible statements that could be more precise interpretations of this one, resolving ambiguities or identifying ambiguities.
Yeah, I can't focus anymore.
Fair enough. It's like, yeah.
Yeah, and I also need to go. I'm not certain I fully get all of that, but.
And some of it I'm realizing there's holes. So
primarily I don't want, because I think you started talking about other things. I really want to focus maybe next time on the interplay between what it means for what context means in what you call a social context versus what context means in what I call a base layer, where there is no context, so you have a global context. I think that's interesting to explore further.
I think so too.
With concrete examples.
Fair enough.
Not in the abstract. So maybe we can pick up that discussion tomorrow.
Good.
Okay, see you then.
Excellent. Thank you.
Bye.
See you then. Bye-bye.